It's July 1933. A prison guard in Le Mans starts his rounds. It's late. The corridor smells like damp stone, old food, and just a tinge of urine. He's used to it because he's done this walk 100 times. Same cells, faces, and sounds day after day. And his feet hurt. But what else is new? There is one cell he always pays a little more attention to. The new prisoner everyone in Le Mans has been talking about. It's in all the papers. First check. She's sitting on the edge of her bed, not sleeping, just staring. So he keeps walking. Second round, the food tray from earlier is still there, untouched. She's barely eaten, if at all. Third check, there is movement inside the cell. She's pacing around the cell, talking quietly to herself, not really to him or any other one else. And on the fourth check, he hears her crying and calling out to someone, not to him, but someone. He doesn't know. But she is sitting and her back is to him. She's rocking and her hands are to her face and it sounds like she's saying something, but he can't hear what it is. So he wants to get closer. He unlocks the cell door and the echo of the keys is almost deafening. Both her hands are still pressed against her face. He steps closer and he leans down slowly. And he realizes this woman isn't covering her eyes. She's trying to remove them. It takes approximately 6.8 pounds of pressure to rupture a human eyeball. That's less pressure than it takes to crack an egg. But rupturing an eye and fully removing one are two different things. And the surgical literature makes clear that even trained surgeons with scissors and forceps have to cut through 6 muscles and sever the optic nerve to get an eye out completely. And actually taking an eye out with your bare hands, it's not something the human body makes easy. An eye is anchored, like I said, by 6 muscles, surrounded by a cushion of fat, and tethered by an optic nerve that does not want to give. It requires sustained, deliberate force, which is what makes it so difficult to understand, because just 5 months earlier, Christine and Leah Papin gouged out the eyes of 2 people with their bare hands. And why is Christine now sitting on a cold prison floor doing the same thing to herself? This is part 3 of the Christine and Leah Papin story. The sisters who, seemingly out of nowhere, killed and mutilated a woman and her daughter. In parts 1 and 2, we trace the childhood of Christine and Leah Papin, shaped by selfish, unstable parents. And somehow, out of all of that, they became the 2 best maids in Le Mans. For 6 years, the Lancelin family trusted them completely. Somewhere along the way, a complaint was filed and ignored. A warning came from the police and was brushed aside because it was always easier to believe the family than it was the maids. Yet the Lancelins still trusted and defended them. But on the evening of February 2nd, 1933, something inside that house cracked. And today, we're not starting with the murders. We're starting on the morning of that cold winter day. The last ordinary morning that the house and the entirety of Le Mans and France would ever have. The morning of February 2nd, 1933 was cold and bitter, and yet it did not slow down the maids who had a full day of work ahead of them. It was, after all, Candlemas. Candlemas is a Christian holiday celebrated 40 days after Christmas, making the day baby Jesus was presented at the Temple of Jerusalem. And in 1930s France, every Catholic observed this day. Churches would bless candles. People genuinely believed those candles would protect their homes from storms or sickness or bad luck even. It was also tied to the end of winter, this quiet hope that spring was coming. And in a respectable bourgeois household like the Lancelins, this holiday was not a day of parties or big celebrations, nothing like Christmas or Bastille Day. It was quiet and domestic. So both Christine and Leah set out first thing in the morning to complete an extensive list of errands. Leah must finish the pile of laundry on the first floor. She wasn't able to finish the laundry the previous day because the iron required to pull all the wrinkles out of the natural fiber linens was out of commission after the cord completely frayed where it meets the plug. This seemingly unimportant nuisance to daily life is important. You'll remember from part 2 that a fuse is designed to fail on purpose. It's the thing standing between the lights flicker and the house burns down. When too much current suddenly surges through a wire, the fuse breaks the circuit before anything worse can happen. But a fuse doesn't just blow for no reason. Something has to cause that surge. And in this case, it was an iron cord, frayed right where it meets the plug. That spot where the cord meets the plug is the weakest point on any cord, because it's the part that gets bent and tugged and flexed every single time the iron is plugged in or pulled out. Do that enough times over enough years, and the insulation protecting the wires inside starts to wear through, crack by crack, bend by bend, until eventually the bare wires underneath are exposed close enough to touch. And when two exposed wires touch each other, electricity stops behaving. Instead of flowing through the iron the way it's supposed to, it takes a shortcut, a short circuit. And for a split second, a surge of current rushes through and bursts through the house wiring far beyond what it was built to handle. That's the moment the fuse does its job. It blows. The lights go out. And so when Leia plugs in the iron the day before, on February 1st, and the fuse blows, this isn't some freak accident. It's a frayed cord doing exactly what a frayed cord does. And here's the part that very much so matters. This was fixable. A cord like that doesn't have to end in a blown fuse in a dark house. If it's brought to someone's attention beforehand, if it's handed over and repaired or even just replaced, it never becomes a problem at all. But that's not what happened in this story. Madame Lancelin wasn't told about a fraying iron cord that needed attention. She found out about a blown fuse and a broken iron that damaged her silk blouse after the fact, in the dark, with no warning that it was coming, and she made the sisters pay for it. Literally, the cost came out of their wages, which means by the time we get to the evening of February 2nd, there's already a quiet resentment sitting underneath all of this. Not just about the fuse, but about a problem that could have been solved quietly, and it wasn't. And two maids who were about to pay for it again. So Leah is busy taking the iron to the Maison d'Homme of Boucher. One, because that laundry will not finish itself, and it's way past its due date. And two, so that Madame will stop being angry about the frayed iron and blown fuse. Thank goodness, Leia thinks, when the shop assistant, Madeleine Blanchet, tells her that they can have the iron repaired and ready for pickup by 3 p.m. that afternoon. Crisis averted. Meanwhile, Christine is also running shopping errands. She stops at the Rue Monchard bakery just as she has for the past 7 years. Christine says, "Give me 720 grams of sliced bread and a specialty loaf, please." And the employee serving her, Mrs. Lefort, knows Christine after all these years and responds, "You're taking less than usual." Christine, "Yes, my employers aren't dining at home this evening, but I still need to get a little bit. Otherwise, I won't have enough left to make tomorrow morning's toast." Mrs. Lefort, "Do you need anything else?" Christine, "Yes, 2 Genoise loaves, 2 brioches, and that will be all, thank you." Knowing both Christine and Leia over the years as customers, Mrs. Lefort had the opinion that they were rather unpolished women. She also noticed that within just the last year alone, they had already spoken and seemed quite sullen. Before that, they would at least engage in brief conversation. And Mrs. Lefort would admit that the relationship was indeed just professional, and the sisters never spoke about their personal lives or their employers. But she would say that Leia especially seemed agitated and nervous with jumpy mannerisms. When the sisters get home after their errands, they prepared and served lunch to the Lancelin family as normal. And Candlemas lunch that day? Crepes. Round, golden, sun-shaped little discs of butter and batter meant to symbolize the sun's returning after a long, dark winter. There was even a superstition. Flip your crepe one-handed while holding a coin in the other, and you were set for a prosperous year. It was cozy and ordinary, the symbol of family, food, and faith. Then, sometime between 2 and 3 p.m., Leia witnessed Mr. Lancelin leave to go to his gentleman's club, with plans to come back around 7 p.m. that night to pick up his wife and daughter for their usual Thursday night Lancelin family dinner at Madame's brother's home, the lawyer Albert Ringard. And for clarification purposes, if your eyes widened at the mention of Mr. Lancelin spending all afternoon at a gentleman's club, I'm here to tell you it's not what you're thinking, maybe. A gentleman's club of this era was like a cross between a private members' lounge, business office library, restaurant, and social network. Membership was exclusive and often required wealth, social standing, or sponsorship. All things Mr. Lancelin had, so it made sense that this was part of his weekly or even daily routine. And if you're as curious as I am about what men got up to in these clubs, I won't let you down. Men would arrive at these clubs without their wives to have lunch or just after having lunch at home, then spend a good chunk of time reading French or international newspapers. They would almost always smoke cigars and drink coffee or brandy. Then, while having political or business discussions, they'd play billiard games, chess, or cards. Sometimes they'd enjoy a leisurely meal and talk about the latest horse races or current affairs. And sometimes they would actually work and meet clients and have meetings right there at the club. So while Mr. Lancelin is out at his club, his wife and daughter Genevieve have their plans. When they left the Lancelin home, they gave no instruction to Christine and Leia, as we are well aware of at this point that the sisters didn't really need direction, as what was expected of them was fully understood by this point. So Madame and her daughter will run a few simple routine errands around town. But then they're going to pay a visit to Madame's other daughter, Genevieve's older sister, and her young son, Pierre. So Pierre would be Madame's grandson and Genevieve's nephew. And Pierre, like most little kiddos in a family, was the apple of his grandparents' eyes. But also the Papin sisters adored little Pierre so much that it was said their faces truly lit up when he would come around and visit the Lancelin home and play in the garden. Albert Regard, who would be Pierre's great-uncle, said, "They genuinely seemed interested in the child and were always ready to slip him a treat or two," talking about the sisters. At this time, all the Lancelins are out of the house and Leia and Christine can finish their chores. Christine said, "There wasn't much washing up to do, since we have made crepes for Candlemas." While Christine is tidying up from lunch, Leia has run out of the house to go fetch the repaired iron from Madeleine Blanchet at the shop. During this time, Mr. Lancelin said, "I left home in the afternoon around 2:30. I returned around 4 o'clock to have a cup of tea that the maids prepared for me, and then head back to the club around 5. Mr. Lancelin came home around 4 in the afternoon for tea, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. Afternoon tea in bourgeois France was a ritual. At first, I assumed it was just about stopping for a drink or a quick pick-me-up, but tea service around 4 o'clock was actually an important part of the daily routine. The servants would lay out the tea service, often with bread, pastries, or biscuits, and the family would pause their day to gather. It wasn't simply about the tea, it was just another way the household reinforced its routines, its order, and even its social status. Given that this was a common bourgeois ritual, René probably wasn't the only one doing it. His wife and daughter were probably having tea with family too, at the eldest Lancelin daughter's house. Also, many men at the club might have headed home for tea as well, meaning the good old boys clubhouse likely emptied out for a while before everyone returned later in the afternoon. In any case, Mr. Lancelin finishes his tea at home and returns to the club around 5 p.m., and everything seems fine and normal, at least at that point. When Leia returns with the repaired iron, a few moments after Mr. Lancelin has left, both Christine and Leia start carrying the wrinkly piles of clean laundry up to the first floor laundry room. This would be about 5:30 in the late afternoon, early evening or so. After all the laundry is piled where it needs to be and hung on the radiator to finish drying, Leia moves through the house, closing all the doors and windows, then heads to the living room to tidy it up as she has every single day since she started working in the home. Meanwhile, Christine is taking her newly repaired iron and plugging it in. Gone were the exposed fuzzy strands. The cord now looked clean, tightly braided, and safe to use. As the iron is heating up, Christine is busying herself organizing the piles of laundry. Later, she said, "I had barely finished arranging the laundry when the spark flew out and the lights went out in the room where I was standing." So Christine shouts, "The blasted fuse, Leia, I've lost power." And Leia responds, "Me? I still have it in here. Our bedroom is out though." Christine then says, "Right, stay put. I'm going down to the kitchen to get a candle. I really needed to finish this ironing today. And this iron fresh back from the electrician, it's just impossible." And her frustration is warranted. Her livelihood depended on completing everything she is tasked to complete while remaining invisible to the family. When something as small as an iron is standing in her way, the agitation must feel intense, as there is no way to solve this problem in a timely timely manner. It would be something that they simply would have to deal with the next day, as the control was really not in their hands at that point. So Christine does as she says and runs downstairs to get a candle. Then both the sisters return to the laundry room with a candle and set it on a small saucer near the laundry. Since they couldn't iron the laundry, both Leah and Christine finished sorting the clothes. Later, investigators would find abandoned in the laundry room 3 women's nightgowns, 1 man's nightshirt, 7 women's day blouses, and 2 pairs of women's trousers, and on the ironing board lay 15 handkerchiefs ready to be ironed. It was around 6 o'clock or 6:15 p.m. when they heard the sound of keys in the door. Madame and Genevieve had returned home. Leah said, "Go and see, Christine. I hear keys. It sounds like they're coming in." Christine said, "That works out well. I'll ask her to take a look at the iron." So she steps out of the laundry room with her candle on the first floor and out onto the dark landing that looks down onto the ground floor where the front entry is just as she sees someone coming through the door. And just so we're super crystal clear about the layout of this house, which I think is really important for what's coming next, there are 3 floors total. The ground floor for entry, the first floor for private rooms, and the attic floor where the sisters live. The ground floor, in America, we would call that the first floor, contained the kitchen in the back, a dining room, Mr. Lancelin's study, and a staircase that led up to the first and second floors. Walk up the staircase and it takes you to a landing. Off of the landing are doors to the bedrooms and private rooms, like the laundry room. If you continue up the stairs, it will take you to the attic where the sisters' rooms and storage spaces are. So the sisters who are in the laundry room on the first floor hear the keys in the door, and Christine says as she's looking down from the first floor staircase to the ground floor, "Is that you, Madame?" Madame says, "Yes, but the power's out." Christine, "The fuse blew. The iron malfunctioned." Madame, "Again?" And she gestures in anger. And now here we are at the very moment in history where so much confusion lies. Christine drops the saucer with the candle, grabs a pewter pitcher sitting on a side table, and lunges at Madame. She smashes the pitcher against Madame's head till she collapses to the ground. This report of what happened almost sounds ridiculous. The iron blows a fuse. Madame Lancelin says, "Again?" and looks annoyed. And then Christine attacks? If that's all there was to it, none of this would make sense. That look of Madame's, the frustration, the disappointment, whatever passed between the 2 women in that split second, was almost certainly not the cause of the violence. At most, it was the trigger. By this point, something inside Christine had already been building for months and maybe possibly even years. Some historians have wondered whether in that instant, Christine didn't see her employer, but instead her own mother, possibly. The woman she described as unpredictable, violent, and terrifying. Was this a familiar scene repeating itself yet again? Another reprimand, humiliation, and another figure of authority she feared? Metaphorically speaking, I think the fuse was the final household failure in a relationship already defined by power, control, and silence. The question isn't why a broken fuse caused a murder, it's why this particular moment became the point where everything exploded. Madame Lancelin may not have been angry because the fuse broke. She may have been angry because of what she believed the fuse represented. In a 1930s bourgeois French household, domestic servants were expected to maintain the home almost invisibly. Their job wasn't just cleaning and cooking, they were responsible for making the household run smoothly. If something went wrong, the servant often became the one blamed, simply because they were the one in charge of the domestic sphere. The sisters had actually told Madame about the outage the day before, but also as soon as she got home that evening. But in her mind, Madame's, that likely didn't register as prompt honesty. It may have registered as proof that something had already gone wrong on their watch, evidence that they weren't doing their jobs. But there was another source of tension surrounding the Lancelin household that week. Just days before the murders, René Lancelin was finally indicted for the collapse of Sarthe Discount Bank, which had ruined small shareholders of the Mutuelle du Mans. His reputation was shattered. Criminal investigation in front of the local magistrates. We will never know whether that turmoil affected the atmosphere inside the home or whether Madame herself was carrying frustrations and anxieties that day. It makes sense if it had, and it is possible that the household tension was higher than usual. But even if the environment was strained, nothing about a servant being met with an irritated "again" could explain what followed. The seconds between Madame Lancelin's irritated remark and the first blow of the pitcher contain a moment inside Christine's mind that history can never fully reconstruct. But the unanswered questions only multiply from there, because even if we can imagine and maybe even justify a sudden explosion of rage, it still cannot explain what happened next. A pewter pitcher striking a skull and a body collapsing onto the floor would not go unnoticed. Madame Lancelin's daughter, who had been waiting in the entryway just beyond the staircase, heard the commotions and rushed up to the first floor to see what had happened. Her mother was under attack. Reacting instinctively, Genevieve moved to defend her, grabbing Christine by the hair and pulling so forcefully that she tore out a handful. This ignited a fierce and violent struggle between the two younger women. Leia, too, heard the commotion and came out onto the landing just as Christine saw Madame begin to push herself up off the floor. Christine shouted at Leia, "Grab her head and smash it to the floor. Gouge out her eyes." Leia later claimed she had never seen her sister in such a state before. Christine was breathing heavily like a rabid animal, and white foam was even spilling from her mouth. But Leia's shock was apparently not enough to make her hesitate, because whatever she saw in Christine at that moment, she still followed her sister's instructions, and she did what she always did, obey. This next part includes disturbing details from the crime scene with graphic descriptions of violence. It's difficult to hear and simultaneously central to understanding the events that unfolded that night. Feel free to skip ahead to the next chapter in the timestamps below in the description if you'd rather avoid this portion of the story. With Christine now on top of Genevieve and Leia restraining Madame Lancelin, the violence escalated beyond anything comprehensible. Christine attacked Genevieve's eyes, and Leia, following her sister's actions, did the same to Madame's. As the attack continued, Leia began mirroring not only Christine's actions, but even the sounds she was making during the assault. In the chaos, both women's carefully pinned hair came loose and their hairpins were scattered across the floor. The violence did not stop, nor did it ease up. Christine picked up the pitcher a second time and struck Genevieve in the face repeatedly, causing severe trauma. She then passed the pitcher to Leia, who used it to strike Madame Lancelin's skull with similar force. The injuries were severe enough that blood and tissue were found on the walls and on nearby paintings, and a pool of blood had formed under both bodies. And it didn't stop. Christine got up off of Genevieve's body and walked down the staircase to the ground floor into the kitchen. She told Leia, "I'm going to slaughter them." As she moved through the kitchen, she left a trail of blood on the floors and on the drawers she opened, pulling out a knife from one and a hammer from the other. She then carried both back to the first floor landing with Leia and the two bodies. When Leia saw what Christine was holding, she ran to the kitchen herself and came back with a small tapered dessert knife with a black handle, adding her footsteps to the bloody path between the kitchen and the landing. By the time she returned, Christine had lifted Madame's dress, who was lying on her back, and Genevieve's dress, who was lying face down. Both women's lower bodies were exposed bare. The assault continued long after the two women had died. Christine is sitting behind Madame and picks up the hammer and begins to smash the base of her spine with it. Leia, with knife in hand, watches Christine intently and then slashes Genevieve's legs so deeply that she reaches the bone, and the knife becomes ineffective. The sisters simultaneously just stop. Silence fills the air, save their heavy breathing. They look at each other, and Christine says, as if they've just had a dinner party, "A fine mess. We both did the same amount, right, Leia?" The sisters' smocks were torn, and evidence at the scene suggested the attack had been beyond physically strenuous. The landing is strewn with broken, mangled objects, dried flowers, a dented stake, numerous hairpins and combs, a hairpiece, a bodice, gloves, 2 handbags, 2 hats, keys, an embroidered dolly, a knife, a hammer, a candle, fragments of a plate, a package in soap wrapping, 2 cakes on a small pedestal table, a button, a rail, pieces of tin, one containing hair, and the lid of the tin pot were all found at the crime scene. Properly worn out, the sisters walk down the first floor steps to the entry and bolt the vestibule door, supposedly so that Mr. Lancelin wouldn't be the one to find the bodies first. But if not him, then who? He lived there and was likely the only other person to come to the house. So if the goal was really to spare him from being first on the scene, it's a strange plan, in my opinion, because there was no version of that night where he wasn't going to be the one standing in that house when the bodies were found. So after locking the vestibule, which By doing so, Mr. Lancelin could not use his key to get into the house. The sisters then go into the kitchen. Bloody from earlier, they begin cleaning up. But before they can finish, the doorbell rings. In fear, they run up the first floor and second floor staircases to their bedroom and lock that door too. Once inside, they strip off their bloody clothes, the mauve cotton smocks, beige cotton stockings, and white slips, and throw them in a pile near the radiator. Wearing only dressing gowns, they climb into the same bed together and huddle up, waiting for whoever is at the door to discover their crime. As we know, Mr. Lancelin was at the club during this attack, and supposedly he was there playing bridge with his man buddies. Around 6:45 p.m., he called his brother-in-law to let him know he was leaving the club and going to pick up his wife and daughter and would be arriving around 7 p.m. for their weekly Thursday night dinner. But when he arrived at his home on Rue Bruyère just before 7 p.m., the house was pitch dark, all save for but one dim light in the attic room, the maid's room. Seeing that the house was dark, he assumed that his wife and daughter already made their way to dinner and left. But of course, they were not at Mr. Lancelin, brother-in-law's house, so he went back. The front door of his house was bolted from the inside, so his key wouldn't work. He knocked and rang the doorbell constantly, but there was no answer. He became more and more frantic. He goes to his other daughter's house, Madeleine, and her son Pierre, and she accompanies him back to the Lancelin house. Neither of them were able to figure out a way into the house, so they decided to go to the police. And then they are both standing in front of Commissioner Dupuy, and Mr. Lancelin says, "Send someone over, Commissioner. This isn't right. The door is locked from the inside. The two maids won't open it for me. I have to get home. I need to pick up my wife and daughter to go to the dinner at Mr. Menage's, my brother-in-law's." And hearing this makes me so sad because it's like even in his panic and worry, he's still telling himself that everything is going to be okay and they'll continue on with dinner as if nothing had happened. The commissioner said, "I'll send 2 officers with me and we'll go." So they arrive back at the Lancelin house once more, and the 2 officers, Agent Rago and Agent Verite, cannot get the door unbolted or open either. So they cut a path through the adjoining garden for 4 Rue Bruyère next door. This would allow access to the back entrance where the police could open the door latch. Once inside, the 2 agents told the Lancelin father and older daughter, "Stay in the living room. I need to go upstairs to see what's happening." By this point, it's in the 9 o'clock hour, and the 2 agents walk from the living room up the first floor staircase with his flashlight. And right there on the first step was something looking right at him, a sole eyeball. They glance up a little higher, and then they see the bodies bathed in blood. They notice the splattered walls and doors. They get closer and see that their faces are so mangled they are completely unrecognizable. Gaping holes for eye sockets, slashed legs, and exposed naked. Agent Verite and Rago are processing this all at once. I don't know how, but they're thinking quick. Mrs. Lancelin and her daughter were surely murdered, and the culprit must be hiding behind one of the upstairs doors. Together, they open all 5 doors on the first floor landing. They find nothing, of course, but then they see a faint glow coming from the very top of the stairs. They listen. No sound. They walk up to the door and turn the knob. It's locked. They stop and listen some more. Dead silence. Agent Verite says to Agent Rago, "Truth be told, the murderer is in there. I'm certain of it." And he responds, "I'll go get Potier, the locksmith. We can't just smash the door down like that." The agents inform Commissioner Dupuy downstairs as to what they found and what they believe is happening. They are concerned about Mr. Lancelin and his daughter, of course, and prevent them from leaving the living room just as before. They knew the news of their death was going to be hard enough, and he didn't want them to see the crime scene. So as the agents are out getting a locksmith, the public prosecutor, Mr. Rieger, his deputy, Mr. Millet-Lacombe, and clerk medical examiner, Dr. Chartier, and the police commissioner of the 3rd arrondissement, Henri Namur, arrived at the house to carry out the standard procedures. Then the locksmith arrives and is easily able to open the attic room door. Inside the room was a confusing sight. The 2 sisters are lying in one bed together with their bedclothes. Their hair is a mess and they are pale with strained expressions. Next to the bed on the floor lay a single bloody hammer. The police lay into them right away. "What have you done to your mistresses?" And Christine says, "They tried to strike me, so I took my revenge. You see, I was waiting for you and will come along quietly." And with that, the police escorted the sisters out of the attic room, down the stairs, over the bodies of the 2 dead Lancelin women and to the central police station. While the sisters are being arrested and taken to the station for questioning, the crime scene is being examined, documented, and photographed. Then the bodies of Madame and her daughter are transported to the morgue. The investigators drew a picture, albeit a confusing one, of the crime scene. It comes with a numbered legend explaining where each piece of evidence was found, but at first glance, it's fairly difficult to read. It took me a while to realize the drawing isn't actually showing the room you enter from Rue Bruyere. Instead, it skips almost the entire ground floor. The only part you see is the front entrance and the staircase, marked number 2, leading up to the first floor. From there, the entire drawing focuses on the first floor because that's where the crime scene was. On the very first step, marked number 3, is where those 2 police agents found an eyeball. Continuing up the first floor landing, you arrive where both victims were found. Marker number 4 indicates where Mrs. Leonie Lancelin's body lay, and number 5 identifies a fragment of her skull found nearby. Number 6 marks the location of Genevieve's body. Markers number 7 through 9 simply identify furniture within the room, but number 10 marks something far more disturbing. Beside a small table leg, the investigators documented the discovery of a section of a colon. Directly across the landing, room number 13 is identified as Genevieve's bedroom. The sketch itself doesn't show the final 2 pieces of evidence, though, but the legend does. Markers number 11 and 12 indicate the additional eyeballs recovered on Mr. and Mrs. Lancelin's bed inside the room labeled number 14. Additionally, the battered, deformed, and flattened pewter jug weighing 1.7 kilograms, which is about 3.7 pounds, was found on the staircase covered in traces of blood and hair, and the bloodstained knife under Madame's body. The investigation was swift and only lasted about 1.5 weeks. Various items were taken from the attic room as evidence. Found there were 2 saving bank books containing between the sum of 24,000 francs and a figure logged as Exhibit 59. So, though curiously, a separate police report puts the amount closer to 9,000 francs, and in every other resource, it's listed as 22,000 francs, a discrepancy that has never been fully explained. But in any case, the money found was a lot, considering the sisters' low wages, or really spoke to how little they spent on themselves. Alongside the money sat a small collection of religious books and a well-worn prayer book, quite evidence of the devotion Christine in particular clung to, even as her mind began to fracture. Investigators also seized the sisters' blood-stained clothing and 2 letters from their mother they found tucked away. Then there were the invoices, mundane scraps of paper that, in the context of a double murder, took on an odd significance. Most drew little scrutiny, but 2 stood out enough to be flagged. Receipts for 2 hats costing 160 francs and 2 pullovers costing 150 francs. These were purchases the investigators judged to be reasonably in line with what the 2 maids could actually afford on their wages. It's a small, almost bureaucratic detail, but it says something about how thoroughly the case was picked apart. Investigators combing not just through the horror of the crime scene, but through the sisters' hat receipts, hunting for anything that might explain who these 2 women really were and what their motives might have been. And then there was the medical report dated later in the summer, June 15th, 1933. This is another section you may wish to skip ahead of, as it contains graphic and distressing content. Louis Chartier, the medical doctor and forensic physician, began by examining the mother, Madame Lancelin, at 7:22 a.m. She was laid out in front of him on the examination table, her displaced eyeballs placed next to her. Chartier's findings were exhaustive and clinical, cataloging injuries that made clear how sustained and total the violence had been. He opened a significant area of her scalp, exposed the dented skull beneath the fragments of metal from the weapon embedded into the bone. Several teeth had been torn loose. Her face, cheek, eye socket, and the eyes themselves were damaged beyond recognition, and 1 ear had even been severed. Genevieve's examination began at 7:47 a.m. Dr. Chartier's report on her injuries was, if anything, even more extensive than her mother's. Her legs and lower body bore numerous knife wounds, though the report noted that these had bled very little, a detail Chartier took as evidence that they were inflicted after death. Like her mother, her face had been rendered unrecognizable, with severe trauma to the jaw and chin. Her upper jawbone was fractured, and a tooth had been forced free by the violence of the blows. Her scalp, too, showed wounds deep enough to reach the bone. Her clothes had been disturbed, pulled down and pushed up in the aftermath, and the report noted a series of parallel wounds and abrasions across her lower back and legs, some shallow, others cut deep enough to reach the muscle and bone. And her hands told their own story. One hand was still clenched around a fistful of coarse hair, presumably from one of the sisters, and both hands bore bruising and cuts across the fingers, with the tip of even one thumb severed entirely. Injuries consistent with a desperate attempt to fend off her attacker. In other words, Genevieve fought like hell. It's worth noting here that the Papin sisters themselves showed no injuries at all. Whatever fight Genevieve put up, or Madame in that case, it wasn't enough to leave a mark on either of their attackers. The imbalance was simply too great for her resistance to have mattered. On July 12, 1933, Inspector Albin Dupuy interrogated Christine Papin and recorded their statements into the official report. It appears that Christine requested the meeting because she said, "I asked to see you to correct my earlier statements. I did not tell you the whole truth. When I attacked Madame Lancelin, she had not provoked me. When I found her on the landing, I asked her if she would fix my electric iron. I do not recall exactly what she replied, but I was seized by a fit of hysteria and rushed at her when she least expected it. In fact, I do not clearly remember how everything unfolded after the crime. I did not want to say exactly what had happened because my sister and I had agreed to share the responsibility equally. But I have just had an episode similar to the one I experienced when I struck Madame Lancelin, and I had a sort of flashback in which the details came flooding back to me. I felt compelled to share this with you immediately." Dupuy asks her, "Explain to me the motives and the circumstances under which you killed your employers." She said, "My crime is great enough for me to speak the truth. When Madame returned, I reported to her that the iron was broken again and that I hadn't been able to do the ironing. Once I told her that, she tried to lunge at me. At the moment, my sister and I and my two mistresses were on the first floor landing. Seeing that Madame Lancelin was about to lunge at me, I sprang at her face. I gouged out her eyes with my fingers. When I say I sprang at Madame Lancelin, I am mistaken. I was at Mademoiselle Lancelin, and it was the latter whose eyes I gouged out. Meanwhile, my sister sprang at Madame Lancelin and gouged out her eyes. I rushed down to the kitchen. We struck their heads with a hammer and slashed their bodies and legs with a knife. We struck them with a pewter pot that was sitting on a small table. We swapped the instruments back and forth several times. The victims started screaming. I don't recall them saying a word, though. When we carried out the deed, I went and bolted the carriage entrance and also shut the vestibule door, because I preferred the police discover our crime rather than our employer. I would rather have done away with our employers than have them do away with us. I did not premeditate my crime. I bore them no hatred, but I could not accept the way Madame Lancelin treated me that evening." Meanwhile, Leia is in the next room having a nervous breakdown and initially claimed that she is deaf and mute. Not sure where she thought that would get her, but later Dupuy asked her the same question that he had asked Christine. "Explain to me the motives and circumstances under which you killed your employers." She responded, "My employers left for town around 3:30. My sister did the ironing and I did the cleaning. Before they left, our employers didn't find fault with us at all. There was no discussion between us. They came back around 6 or 6:15. And that was it. No other detail given." She refused to go into anything further. So Dupuy reads Leah what Christine said in response to the questions, then was asked, "Is what Christine Papin said accurate?" Leah said, "Everything my sister told you is accurate. The crimes unfolded exactly as she described them. My role in this affair is precisely the one she indicated. I struck just as many as she did. Like her, I maintain that we did not premeditate killing our employers. The idea came to us instantly when Madame Lancelin was criticizing us. I do not have the slightest regret for the criminal act we committed. Like my sister, I would rather have had my mistresses' lives than have them take ours." Before you struck your mistresses, you and your sister, had they struck you? They didn't strike us, but they did make the gesture of wanting to do so. I repeat, I would rather have had their lives than have them take ours. And I repeat again, I have no regrets. I found it interesting that while simultaneously insisting they felt no hatred toward the victims, Leah reiterated that she has no regrets. Yet neither of the sisters could provide a coherent motive. And I think you're with me here in that being criticized and lunging were not quite adding up to be a worthwhile motive. But let me know in the comments what you think. Later on February 22nd, Leah was shown and asked about the pair of scissors found on the small table on the first floor landing near the bodies. She said, "I did not use the scissors, which my sister had brought last summer at Friel's. I had brought them with me from the kitchen where they were usually kept to put them in the linen room near the bedroom where I intended to do some mending. Then the Lancelin ladies arrived. I brought them back down to work in the kitchen, since there was no longer any light on the second floor. I must have dropped them when the incident began and picked them up when we went down to the kitchen to wash ourselves. As I had blood on my hands, I must have stained them that way. There's certainly a dissonance here that I cannot fully explain, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on them." It was then, after their interrogations, that both Christine and Leah Papin were charged with crimes defined and punishable under Articles 295 for intentional homicide classified as murder and 302 of the Penal Code for assassination, parricide, or poisoning. These are punishable by death. The sisters were housed separately in the jail. They protested vehemently, of course. When the guard separates their cells, Christine tries scratching the guard's face while shouting, "You are an accomplice to the justice system, but you will pay for this later." On February 5th, Christine and Leah refused to eat or drink for about a week. But what followed developed into something far stranger than a simple hunger strike. Christine began to hallucinate, seeing religious visions that appeared to consume her entirely. She wept, she prayed, and she traced holy symbols onto surfaces with her tongue, as though trying to anoint herself or ward something off. It reminded me of her somewhat compulsive behavior when the war started and she feared for her father's safety, as if this was the only way she knew how to manage the distress. At this point, the warden told the prosecutor that Christine was in a severe state of agitation. It started with Christine bolting upright from bed and rushing to the cell door window. She gripped it with both hands and cried out, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. I'm the one who attacked Madame Lancelin." One guard named Eugenie Thierry rushed over to release Christine's grip from the bars and calm her down. And her mind seemed to be looping back to the crime itself, though not in any way that made sense to those around her. She asked again and again where Madame and Genevieve were, as if she didn't fully grasp or couldn't accept that they were dead by her own hand. She spoke of reincarnation, of lives lived before this one, and told those around her, "Sometimes I think in another life I was my sister's husband." It was a strange, telling line, one that hinted at just how thoroughly her identity had fused with Leia's, and how thoroughly it was now coming apart. Alarmed by her unraveling, prison officials made the decision to briefly reunite the two sisters, hoping the sight of Leah might pull Christine back from wherever she'd gone. On February 11th, they had the sisters dine together in hopes that she would eat and drink again. Christine threw her arms around Leah and held on, repeating the same desperate plea over and over. Tell me yes, tell me yes. Though what exactly she needed confirmed, no one could say for certain. Whether it was that Leah was really her sister, like, yes, tell me yes, it's you, or that she still loved her, tell me yes, you still love me, or none of it had really happened, say yes, it never happened, and all the words carried the weight of a mind grasping for something solid to hold on to and finding only her sister's arms. Dr. Pierre Schutzenberger came to examine Christine sometime after this, and what he found was a woman who had grown noticeably more guarded than the one investigators had spoken to back in February. She seemed to understand exactly why he was there. You've come to see me in case I'm sick. But where she had once answered questions directly, she now retreated the moment a subject grew uncomfortable, cutting him off with a flat refusal. You already know, I'm not going to repeat it again, I won't say anything more. When he had first entered her cell, he found her lying on the floor, cheek pressed to the ground, eyes wet with tears. The picture of a woman in collapse. But Schutzenberger wasn't convinced. He'd heard the guard's footsteps announce their arrival, and by the time he reached her, what he felt was a performance, didn't hold up to scrutiny. Her hair was dusted from the floor as expected, but her cheek, supposedly pressed against the same ground, was clean. Only a tear or two had actually fallen, landing on her bodice rather than the floor beneath her. To the doctor, the details didn't add up, and he became convinced he was watching a woman perform distress rather than live it. Pressed further, Christine admitted as such, 3 separate times apparently, by his account, confessing that she'd staged the display in hopes he might earn her a reunion with Leia. On another visit, Schutzenberger asked her outright, "You put on an act the other day. Wednesday?" She answered, "Yes, sir, yes, but I didn't put on the madman's act." Doctor, do you realize the gravity of your admission? Christine, I am placing myself in your hands because I have no other choice. Later on July 12th, she acted severe enough that the jail had no choice but to protect her from herself and others. In a letter from the chief guard at the detention center to the investigating magistrate, he said, I have the honor to report that the Papin woman is in a state of extreme agitation. Last night, I was forced to put her in a straitjacket to prevent her from gouging out her own eyes. The accused stated that she intended to gouge out the eyes of the investigating magistrate, Maître Brière, and the female guards. Furthermore, she attempted to bite several of the fellow inmates who had stepped in to restrain her. Christine's 60-year-old cellmate, Lucie Tessier, reported that she had witnessed violent outbursts and said, during these episodes, she suddenly rises from her bed and rushes off in search of her sister. She utters coarse language and loudly calls for her sister. She also asks for her husband and child. She kisses the ground and makes the sign of the cross with her tongue. On the floor, on the furniture, on the walls. She attempted to gouge out her own eyes in my presence, and, as I held her back, she seized my right hand and placed it in her mouth between her teeth. I had to twist her nose to make her let go, and I even slapped her twice. She was thrashing about wildly, so the guards had to put her in a straitjacket. She is still very agitated, and we are on edge, especially at night. But the other inmates and I are keeping a close watch on her, and we are determined not to be subjected to her violence. Before her first major violent episode, she experienced a sort of hallucination. She claimed to see her sister hanging from a tree with her legs severed. Sometimes, she tells us, I'm lost, they're going to cut off my head, so what should I do? If they have to cut me open, I'll just go all the way. During her episodes while shouting obscenities, she has been known to lift her skirts in front of us. I believe she is hysterical and that all the manifestations she exhibited appeared at the time of her menstruation. And this other inmate she mentions is Raymond Logre, who observed Christine's episodes are violent. For a good month now, Christine Papin, who is detained alongside me, has been prone to violent outbursts during which she screams and howls, trying to bite anyone nearby. She foams at the mouth, utters obscenities, and even lifts up her skirts. I have seen her try to gouge out her own eyes. We were forced to intervene and pull her hands away off her face, and the attendants were forced to put her in a straitjacket. At present, she does nothing but pray, kneeling and making the sign of the cross with her tongue on the floor, the walls, and the cupboard. Between these episodes, she would go silent for long stretches, repeating somewhere deep into the trenches of her own mind, before surfacing again into fits of bizarre, sexually charged displays that unsettled everyone who witnessed them. The examining doctors believe that these events and displays did not stem from mental pathology, but rather that Christine engaged in a fit of anger and acts of feigning illness in order to avoid being separated from her sister. A few days later, on July 19th, Christine wrote a letter to the prison administrator. Mr. Boutier, I ask you to please request an explanation from me regarding what I told and recounted to you, and please grant me the permission to see you so I can explain my life. However, I do not wish to be alone with you for this explanation, and I ask that you please allow me to be with my sister, Leia Papin. Please grant me permission to see my sister, Leia Papin, again. Naturally, the investigating judge ordered a psychiatric evaluation, which was conducted over several months and concluded in the summer of 1933 by expert Pierre Schutzenberger, prepared in collaboration with doctors Victor Truel and Jacques Broruc. The purpose of this examination was not simply to determine whether Christine and Leia were insane, but the court needed to understand something much more complicated. Who were these women before the murders? What was their mental state at the time of the crime? And could their actions be explained by a psychiatric disorder? When Dr. Schutzenberger examined Christine, he found no physical abnormalities, no memory impairment, and no significant family history of mental illness. To a modern audience who may have watched the first couple of parts of this series, this statement might seem surprising to you. Because looking backward with what we know today, there are several pieces of the family history that stand out. Their mother, Clémence, displayed behaviors that modern observers might question as possible signs of a severe personality disturbance. Their father struggled with alcohol, which we now understand can be connected to a number of underlying psychological and social problems. There were also reports of mental illness elsewhere in the extended family, including an uncle who died by suicide and another relative who spent time in an asylum. But this is where we have to be careful with our lens. The doctors in 1933 were not working with our modern understanding of mental health. Their definition of mental illness was much narrower. They were not looking at family trauma, emotional instability, personality disorders, addiction, or patterns of dysfunctional relationships in the way we might today. They were looking for recognizable psychiatric disorders, conditions that could be identified through the medical knowledge of their time. And it is also possible that the doctors, or even the sisters themselves, simply did not have access to all of the family information we have today. A family history is only as complete as the information investigators were able to collect. This distinction matters because the question before the court was not simply, were the Papin sisters raised in a troubled family? Looking back, the answer to that appears to be a resounding yes. The question was, did they suffer from a recognized mental disorder that could explain the crime? And based on the psychiatric knowledge of 1933, the experts concluded that they did not find evidence of one. Additionally, the report conceded that Christine's intelligence was considered average. When asked why she was not working, she simply replied, "I do not have to work. As I am an accused person, I will have time to work if I am convicted." Most importantly, she appeared to understand exactly what she had done and the consequences she faced. When asked about the possibility of execution, she responded, "I'll be punished right up until the moment my head is cut off. It makes no difference to me. I've killed, so too bad for me." So while the doctor found no evidence of mental illness, he did note something unusual about Christine's emotional life. He wrote that her affectivity presents certain peculiarities in that it is, in a sense, selective and focused solely on her younger sister, Leia. In other words, Christine's entire emotional world appeared to revolve around her younger sister. And this is no surprise to us, of course. And after everything that had happened, the violence of the crime and the sister's behavior afterward, and Christine's desperate attempts to be reunited with Leia in prison, people began searching for another explanation. Was this attachment simply the bond between two sisters who had endured the same hardships? Or was there something else beneath it? The psychiatrists examined the question directly. Regarding romantic relationships, Christine said she had no romantic thoughts and no hopes of marriage. The experts found no signs of possessiveness, obsession, revenge, or a hidden romantic fixation. And medical examinations confirmed her virginity. And at first glance, that seems like an incredibly invasive and irrelevant thing to include in a murder investigation, and frankly, it made me shudder. But to understand why it's there in the report and why it happened, we have to step into the mindset of psychiatry of the 1930s. The doctors weren't simply trying to determine whether Christine was sane, they were trying to build a complete psychological profile. They believed a person's romantic life, sexual history, emotional attachments, and attitudes toward marriage could all reveal something about their mental state and, more importantly, about their motives. So they asked questions that today would seem wildly inappropriate. Had she ever been in love? Did she want to get married? Had she ever had a sexual relationship? Did she have unusual attachments? Was there any evidence of sexual obsession or what the era called sexual perversion? These weren't side questions. To the psychiatrists of the 1930s, they were considered central to understanding why someone had committed a violent crime. And we'll talk more about this later, but by this point, there were already whispers surrounding Christine and Leia's unusually close relationship. The court wanted to rule out every possible motive, including whether the murders had anything to do with a secret romantic relationship between the sisters or some other sexual fixation. So when the report states that Christine had no interest in marriage, that medical examination confirmed her virginity. and that the doctors found no evidence of sexual obsession or an inappropriate attachment to Leah, they weren't making a moral judgment. They were documenting why they believe the murders were not driven by a sexual motive. So according to the psychiatric report, Christine's behavior after the murders did not resemble someone who had acted out a long-standing obsession and then experienced relief after finally releasing it. Nor did she show signs of epilepsy or another condition that could explain the violence. The most striking difference between the sisters was not their emotional state, but their personalities. Christine was viewed as the more dominant and assertive sister, while Leah was considered quieter and more passive. Even their intelligence was described differently. Leah's was considered normal, but her academic performance had been much weaker than Christine's. Yet, despite their differences, the experts found the same pattern. Leah showed no signs of hatred, persecution delusions, hallucinations, or a desire for revenge against the Lancelins. After the murders, she did not experience a sense of liberation. Like Christine, Leah's emotional attachments appeared concentrated almost entirely on her sister. But Dr. Schussenberger made an important distinction. He wrote that Leah's attachment to Christine was intense, but not abnormal. There was nothing unusual about this, especially considering that the two sisters lived together without any other family. The report went further. No ambiguous motives or sexual attachments could be detected. Leah's affection for Christine appeared to be familial, almost filial. After all, Christine, as the older sister, had filled a role that went beyond ordinary sibling relationships. To Leah, Christine was not simply a sister, she was also a protector, a substitute parent even, her closest connection in a world where almost every other relationship had failed her. When Leah expressed regret, it was brief and revealing. "We went too far," she said. In another section of the report, Dr. Schussenberger noted that much of the information gathered about the sisters was actually positive. Their reputations had darkened after the crime, but he suggested that the deterioration of their character may have been connected to their painful relationship with their mother. As for the idea that the sisters suffered from a persecution delusion, that they believed the Lancelins were deliberately tormenting them by screaming at them and slamming their heads into the walls, the doctor remained cautious. The police commissioner had not provided definite evidence of such statements, and the report noted that if the sisters had truly displayed delusional beliefs, the commissioner likely would have remembered and documented them. The supposed persecution, therefore, did not appear significant enough to explain the crime, and the final question remained. How could two women with no obvious psychiatric illness, with no apparent motive, commit such extreme violence? The experts considered whether the brutality could have been a result of an epileptic episode or an uncontrollable impulsive state. But they rejected that explanation. In their view, nothing in Christine's medical history or examination fit the pattern they would expect. They found no history of seizures, no so-called masked epileptic episodes, no fugue states, and no evidence of the kinds of neurological symptoms they associated with epilepsy. That conclusion, however, would soon be challenged, because by the time the trial began, Christine had already suffered a dramatic psychological collapse inside Saint-Méen prison, one so severe that it forced the court to ask a new question. If she wasn't suffering from epilepsy, then what exactly had happened to her? The violence was real and the brutality was undeniable. But the psychiatrist could not find a simple medical explanation for it. On September 27, 1933, Christine wrote another letter. "Mr. President, I ask you please, sir, to tell me what I should do because I have a terrible pain in my brain and to tell me how I can make it disappear. Please accept my deepest respect." All in all, their conclusion in the report was unambiguous. The sisters were fully responsible for their actions at the time of the crime. The absence of any clear motive might, on the surface, suggest the work of deranged minds, but the doctors were firm that this was not the case. In their assessment, Christine and Leah were not insane. They showed no evidence of any pathological mental disorder that might have diminished their culpability. This conclusion will, of course, be debated at the trial. Christine was represented by Maître Germaine Brière, a remarkable figure in her own right. In 1933, she was already part of a generation of women who had only begun recently to enter the French legal profession. Briere had become one of the first women admitted to the bar in France, a field that had historically been almost entirely closed to women. Maître Chotampo represented Leia. The victim's family would also retain lawyers in August of 1933 to protect their best interests, too, regarding the civil suit. The trial began at the Sarthe Assize Court on Friday, September 29, 1933, almost 8 months after the murders. The area around the courthouse was heavily guarded with 200 police officers, as the story about the Papin Sisters had become a national sensation. There was even a municipal order placed to prohibit gathering at the courthouse for the trial, and car traffic was being diverted away from the courthouse. It did not, however, stop people from shouting for their execution. 7 soldiers stood in the court gallery with bayonets fixed. As over 40 journalists and photographers were admitted, they were warned that order must be maintained in the courtroom at all times. At 1:30 p.m., a bell rang out in the courtroom and the bailiff announced, "Gentlemen, the court." At this, everyone rose to stand. Into the gallery came Mr. Buescher, a justice from the Angers Court of Appeal, who would preside over the trial. His presence was a reminder of just how serious this case was. The Papin sisters were not appearing before an ordinary criminal court. They were facing the Cour d'assises, the highest criminal court in France, reserved for the most serious crimes, including murder and offenses that could carry the death penalty. Cases like this demanded the experience of a senior magistrate to guide the proceeding. But Judge Buescher was not alone. Following him were 3 additional judges from the Le Mans court of the first instance, Judges Bouvier, Desnots, and Gérin. They were part of the judicial panel. They would listen to the testimony, examine the evidence, weigh the arguments, and participate in the court's final decision. And then there was the jury. Unlike the judges who represented legal expertise and the authority of the state, the jurors represented ordinary citizens. Their role was to bring the perspective of the public into the courtroom, to decide whether the evidence proved the sisters' guilt beyond the legal questions presented by the judges. There were 12 jurors and 1 alternate juror. And as it was not lawful for women to vote or serve as jurors until 1944, the panel was made up of 13 men, a fact worth sitting with given that the 2 people on trial were women, and the 2 people they killed were women too. Whatever verdict emerged from that courtroom, it would be reached through the eyes of men. Those men were, in almost every sense, ordinary. 5 were farmers, men who worked the land of the Sarthe countryside and had likely never given a moment's thought to psychiatry or class theory before this case landed on their doorstep. There were 2 notaries spending their days behind desks settling property disputes and drafting contracts, not parsing the architecture of a broken mind. The rest rounded out a cross-section of provincial trades such as a carpenter, a wheelwright, a property owner, and a military agent. The oldest was a 61-year-old wheelwright, and the youngest was a 30-year-old farmer. Waiting in reserve in case illness or misfortune thinned their ranks before a verdict came in, sat a 45-year-old baker, Alphonse Proudhon, as the alternate juror. No doctors, no psychologists, no women. Just 13 working men of Le Mans and its surrounding villages, pulled from their fields and workshops and asked to decide, largely on instinct and testimony, whether 2 sisters were monsters or mad women. Together, the magistrates and the jury formed the body that would decide the fate of Christine and Leia Papin, a combination of legal judgment and public consequence, attempting to answer one impossible question. How should France judge 2 women accused of one of the most shocking and gratuitous murders the country had ever seen? Then into the courtroom gallery entered the Papin sisters and their attorneys. It was odd, though. The public expected to see 2 monstrous women, and what they saw wasn't that. Christine's gaunt-like gaze was lowered, a modest bun peeked out from the nape of her neck, and she wore a light beige high-collared coat with a blue blouse underneath. Leia appeared more fearful, with a vacant stare, and wore a dark-colored coat. The presiding judge declares the start of the proceedings. He asks the accused to state their identities as well as remind the attorneys Article 311 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and they are to comply with them. Then the jurors take their oath. Finally, the court clerk reads aloud the committal order and the indictment, all standard procedures. The list of witnesses are submitted by both the prosecutor and the defense. The expected witnesses would be the commissioners, policemen, witnesses to the timeline like the brother, forensic pathologists, doctors who performed the psych evaluation, Christine's cellmates, and an expert doctor by the name of Joseph Logre. Now, before Christine and Leah Papin ever stepped into the courtroom, the presiding judge had already spent weeks studying the case. Because this was a French criminal trial in the 1930s, the courtroom worked very differently from what many people today would recognize from an American trial, say. This was not a simple battle between a prosecutor and a defense attorney, with the judge acting only as like a referee. Trials were built around a judge-led search for the truth. In French legal language, this idea was known as la manifestation de la vérité, the discovery of the truth. Before the trial began, the presiding judge reviewed the entire investigative file, known as the dossier. This file contained the evidence gathered during the investigation by the examining magistrate, witness statements, expert reports, interrogations, and the detail of the crime scene itself. Then, when the trial started, the first major examination was not led by the prosecutor or the defense. It began with the judge questioning the accused. The judge would ask about everything: their childhood, their family, their work, their relationships, personality, whether they had any previous criminal record, and finally, the events that brought them before the court. The purpose was to give the jury a complete understanding of the people sitting before them and to compare their answers with the statements already collected during the investigation. And this is where the Papin Sisters trial becomes so frustrating. The court was prepared to ask them questions, and the public was desperate for answers. Everyone wanted to understand what could have driven two seemingly ordinary domestic servants to commit such a brutal crime. But Christine and Leah Papin would offer very little. Christine never once looked up, her face betraying nothing except an occasional grimace when certain facts were recounted. Both sisters remained eerily calm and orderly throughout, as if they had no real sense of where they were or even what they were facing. They obeyed every order given: stand, sit, speak, say yes or no, with the mechanical ease of muscle memory, never resisting, never hesitating. It was this very composure that confused the public and the press alike. Where were the disheveled, screaming young women the country had been promised back in February? So after the judge has Christine and Leah state their identities, he outlines their childhood, family background, and domestic service history. The circumstances of the crime were also recounted in detail, as well as the autopsy report. This gives the jury and the public full context of what had happened. Then he questions Christine. Did Madame Lancelin raise her hand and strike you? Say yes or no. Christine, no. Judge, did she simply say to you, again? Christine, she said nothing. I was the one who attacked her. Judge, you took the pewter pot and struck Madame Lancelin on the head. Is that correct? Christine, I stunned her. Judge, Madame Lancelin collapsed. Mademoiselle Lancelin arrived. Did she grab you by the hair? Christine, I was the one who attacked her. Judge, after felling the mother, you wanted to fell the daughter. She tried to defend herself. Since you were the one who had attacked her, she defended herself. Was that when your sister arrived? Christine, she was right beside me. So as you just heard, the judge got very little out of Christine. A confession, sure, but people needed more than that. No one questioned who had done this. What they craved was why, because none of it made sense on its face, and that was the one answer the judge could not pull from her. Since Christine offered so little on the stand, he turned to the official interrogation transcripts from the investigation, reading aloud the details she'd gone quiet on in court, including her own admission to the investigators that it was she who told Leah to tear out Madame Lancelin's eyes. The judge then turned to Leah for questioning, but she just sits there mumbling. So the judge says, I will say it for you if you do not wish to speak. Meaning, he will read out the information in the official records if she won't speak for herself in this moment. So Leah says, I went for Madame Lancelin's eyes. Judge, when your sister saw that Madame Lancelin was trying to get up, was it she who said to you, gouge out her eyes? Leah, yes. Judge, you rushed at her. You stunned her by banging her head against the floorboards and gouged out her eyes. How? Leah, with my fingers. Judge, what did you do with the knife? Leah, I made incisions in her legs. The judge then asks both the sisters about any motive. Did they have any grievances against their employers? Both Christine and Leah reaffirmed that they did not premeditate their act and had no grievances against their employers. And then there was an uncomfortable shift in the courtroom when the judge turned to a question that, in 1933 France, was considered deeply taboo: the nature of Christine and Leah Papin's relationship. Now, if you've watched the films, read the articles, or even just heard this case discussed over the years, you might assume the rumors about a romantic or incestuous relationship between the sisters were based on some kind of discovery made during the investigation, because I certainly did. It is one of the most repeated parts of the Papin Sisters story. It appears so often that it starts to feel like a confirmed fact, like there must have been something in the evidence that proved it. But when you actually go back to the trial records and the investigative files and the official accounts, that evidence simply doesn't exist. There is nothing that even slightly proves that Christine and Leah had sexual or romantic relationship. But what does exist are observations that people at the time, and many people afterward, interpreted through the lens of their own assumptions. The sisters were intensely close. They shared a bed. Christine was desperate to be reunited with Leah after their arrest. They had spent their everyday lives together, isolated from almost everyone else. And in a society where homosexuality was deeply stigmatized and relationships between women were often misunderstood, that closeness became something people wanted to explain. But when you look at everything we have learned about these two women, their childhood and abandonment, the time in institutions, the years working together, and then the trauma they carried too, it is not difficult for me at least to understand why Christine and Leah would have formed such an intense, possibly codependent bond. They were not just sisters. They were each other's only constant. The judge asks Leah, "Earlier, I spoke of the affection that bound you to your sister. Did you hear the question I put to her? I am asking you now. Your sister claims there was nothing abnormal about your relationship, that it was based solely on family ties. Nothing more than that passed between you?" Leah simply said, "No." And the judge clarified this question. "I was speaking of a sexual relationship, of romantic intimacy. There was nothing of that sort?" And Leah would say nothing more on the topic. So why did the judge ask these questions if there was no evidence and the sisters denied any such relationship? Because in a case like this, no possibility could be ignored. The court needed to eliminate every possible explanation. Was the murder connected to some hidden romantic obsession or jealousy? Or was the answer found somewhere else? In years of anger, fear, humiliation, and a relationship with the outside world that had left them completely isolated. The judge asked directly whether their affection was simply familial or whether there was something more. Christine's answer was clear when she said there was, quote, "nothing else between us," unquote. And officially, that was the end of that line of inquiry, but the rumor did not end there. Over time, speculation became so intertwined with the story that many people began repeating it as fact. The tragedy is that the most sensational explanation, the one people found most fascinating, was never the one supported by the evidence. The questioning of the sisters did little to clarify any motive or understanding beyond what the court and public already knew from the official reports. If any blanks were going to be filled, it would have to come from other witnesses. Christine's two cell inmates took the stand and confirmed everything in the report that we've already discussed here. And they emphasized the intensity of Christine's episodes. But when the doctors that conducted the examination of Christine and the psych report testified, they too reiterated what was in the report, but also that those episodes the inmates testified to, they believe, was an act because Christine didn't have any bruising on her hands or eyes that would indicate she was truly trying to harm herself. Renee Lancelin and the other witnesses from the family described Christine and Leah as excellent servants. Their work was considered reliable, and there had been no major complaints about their performance. But there was one change they noticed. After 1929, the year the sisters' relationships with their mother deteriorated, their behavior began to shift. On their days off, they stopped going out. They stayed inside their room. Their expressions became darker. Witnesses described them as withdrawn, sad, and almost closed off from the world. But the difficult part is that in 1933, few people understood emotional trauma. dysfunctional family relationships, or the psychological impact of abuse in the way we do today. Domestic servants, especially young working class women, were not always seen as people whose inner lives required attention. The mother's conflict with the daughters was considered a private family matter. A maid's sadness was not necessarily seen as a warning sign. And so the people around Christine and Leah noticed that something had changed, but they did not have the language or the knowledge, or perhaps even the social position to understand what that change meant. But of course, in any case, the doctor's testimony confirming what they wrote in the psych report would be the most impactful for the jury anyway. On the stand, Dr. Baruch stated, "From a strictly medical standpoint, we maintain that there is neither disease nor defect. One might perhaps split hairs in the realm of psychology, but it is certain that nothing can, medically speaking, diminish the responsibility of the two accused women." And Dr. Turrell said, "No signs of mental illness, no persecution complex, no melancholia, no epilepsy. Christine is normal. Leah's intellectual faculties are undoubtedly less developed, yet she is nonetheless fully responsible for her actions." The defense then called Dr. Logre to the stand, a psychiatrist whose testimony would challenge the conclusions reached by the 3 court-appointed experts. Before presenting his disagreement, Dr. Logre first acknowledged the work of his colleagues. He did not question their competence or their efforts. But after examining the case, he believed there were important elements they had not fully addressed. The first was the crime itself. According to Dr. Logre, this was a murder that appeared to have no immediate motive or an extremely weak one. And yet, what followed was a level of violence that was difficult to reconcile with such limited trigger. He points to the ferocity of the attack, the relentlessness of the violence, and the most disturbing detail of all, the removal of the victim's eyes. To Dr. Logre, the question was, what psychological state could explain such extreme violence? He then outlined several possible explanations. The first was the possibility of a persecution complex, a belief that they were being targeted, mistreated, or threatened. To support this possibility, he referred to the incident at the town hall with the mayor, claiming the Lancelins were persecuting them, but offered no detail or explanation of their accusations, suggesting it may have revealed a distorted perception of events. He then turned to what he considered another troubling aspect of the case, the relationship between the two sisters. Dr. Logre described an extraordinary psychological dynamic between them, where Leah's personality appeared almost completely eclipsed by Christine's. The younger sister, in his view, seemed to exist largely through her attachment to her older sister. He also drew attention to Christine's behavior while in prison, including what he interpreted as sexual preoccupations, and compared this with the injuries inflicted on the victims. To him, these details raised further questions about the psychological forces behind the crime. Finally, he considered the possibility of hysteroepilepsy, a diagnosis used at the time to describe extreme psychological or neurological states. But Dr. Logre's conclusion was not that the sisters were definitively insane. Instead, his argument was that the available evidence did not allow anyone to be certain. He explained that based on the facts of the case, he could not determine that the Papin sisters had acted during a fit of madness, but neither could forensic experts confidently assert that they were completely sane either. For that reason, he argued that the second psychiatric examination was necessary, conducted in a specialized facility. As he stated, "It is always possible to determine that a person is ill, even if one cannot immediately say what the nature of the illness is." In Dr. Logre's view, the uncertainty itself was enough to justify further investigation. Before the court reaches a verdict, no doubt should remain about what the mental state of the accused is. I think it's important to note here that unlike Drs. Baruch, Schutzenberger, and Turrell, who personally examined Christine and Leah, Dr. Logre never met with the accused women, and he did not conduct his own psychiatric evaluation of them. His testimony was based entirely on his review of the existing case materials and the conclusions reached by other experts. This does not mean his opinion was insignificant. Dr. Logre was a highly respected psychiatrist with extensive experience, and his disagreement carried enough weight that the court allowed him to present his concerns. But his argument was ultimately a challenge to the interpretation of the evidence, not a diagnosis based on his own examination of Christine and Leah. So after hearing Dr. Logre's testimony, the three original experts, Drs. Baruch, Schutzenberger, and Truvell, returned to the stand and reaffirmed the conclusions of their report that we are all aware of by now. But the disagreement between the psychiatrists gave the defense an opportunity. Maître Choton, Leah's attorney, requested a supplementary investigation into the mental state of the sisters and asked that the trial be postponed until another expert examination could be conducted. Maître Moulier, the attorney representing the family in the civil matter, responded that he did not see the necessity of another examination, but he would not oppose the court considering the request. The public prosecutor, however, strongly objected. His argument was that the court should rely on the findings of the three officially appointed experts who had already completed their work, stating, "We must abide by the word of the three legally appointed experts. They have given their opinion. The matter is settled." At 5:00 p.m. that night, the hearing was suspended while the judges withdrew to deliberate. 15 minutes later, the court returned with its decision. The presiding judge read the ruling. The request for a new psychiatric evaluation was denied. The court found that the three appointed experts had already thoroughly examined the accused, reviewed the case file, and fulfilled their duties after prolonged observation. No new fact had been presented that had not already been considered, and another examination would only delay the proceedings. With both sides having presented their psychiatric arguments and witnesses, the civil party now had the opportunity to speak. For viewers unfamiliar with the French legal system, the civil party was not the same thing as the prosecution. The Lancelin family had formally joined the criminal proceedings as victims, which gave their lawyer, Maître Moulier, the right to participate in the trial and present arguments on their behalf. His role was to represent the interests of the Lancelin family, to defend their reputation, challenge claims that the Papin sisters were victims, and support the conclusion that Christine and Leah were fully responsible for their actions. Maître Moulier began his statements by explaining why the Lancelin family had filed as a civil party in the first place. They wanted to respond to the way some newspapers had portrayed the Papin sisters as victims of an oppressive bourgeois system. Those articles suggested that the sisters' lives had been so difficult and wretched, that the work demanded of them had been so harsh and arduous that the crime had to be understood as the result of their suffering. To counter the image of Christine and Leah as exploited victims, Maître Moulier presented a very different portrait of their employment with the Lancelins. He read letters from former servants who described the family favorably and argued that the sisters had been treated well. One such report from Augustin Courbillon stated, "I entered the service of Mr. and Mrs. Lancelin immediately after my marriage. I stayed for about 10 years. I was very happy there and have absolutely no cause for complaint, considering they were excellent employers. They gave me instructions very kindly and, when the occasion arose, offered friendly guidance." So, Maître Moulier stated, the sisters were fed just like the masters. The maids earned over 150 francs a month. He also pointed out that when the sisters were asked whether they had complaints about their employers, they repeatedly said they considered the position a good one. As he argued, they always replied that they found the position a good one and that, had they not found it so, they would not have stayed there for such a long time. And he added that Christine herself had chosen to bring Leah into the household, saying, "If Christine Papin had not first found the position desirable, she would not have brought her sister there." Moulier had turned to the crime itself and attacked the sisters' explanation that the murders occurred during an uncontrollable fit of rage. He called that defense foolish because it stands in absolute contradiction to Madame Lancelin's past character, habits, and upbringing, and because it flatly contradicts the medical findings subsequently made regarding the accused as well as all the circumstances of the case. He also criticized the decision to focus so heavily on the idea of a sudden fit of rage, arguing that the investigation had not sufficiently considered premeditation, stating, "The indictment division accepted the fit of rage version so readily and appeared unwilling to dwell for even a moment on the issue of premeditation." He argued that if there had truly been a chaotic struggle, Madame and Genevieve Lancelin, both healthy adults, would have fought back. Yet he pointed out that not a single scratch or mark of a blow was found on the bodies of the Papin sisters. The lawyer also rejected alleged rumors that the sisters had romantic relationships with members of their employer's family, stating, "They went so far as to attribute lovers to these girls, lovers chosen from among the families of their victims." He also sought to dismiss claims that the sisters were influenced by spiritualism. One official report dated February 10, 1933 from Alliance de l'Alliance stated, "I represented the French spiritualist communion, and I state that I do not know the two sisters, as they have never set foot in my home." An investigation conducted in the Delan neighborhood confirms that no one saw the Papin sisters going to the said spiritualist's house. And most importantly, he would defend the conclusions of the psychiatric experts who had determined that the accused were fully responsible for their actions. To the civil party, the experts' conclusions were clear. You have heard their testimony. It is impossible to be clearer, more precise, or to appear more self-assured than these gentlemen were. From the standpoint of hereditary physical constitution and pathology, they told us that neither woman exhibits any defect capable of diminishing her criminal responsibility in any way. Then he turned his attention to Dr. Logre. Moulier questioned the neutrality of an expert who had not personally examined the sisters, saying, "Isn't he, to some extent, serving one of the parties? Doesn't he take the stand with the mission of testifying in the way that favors the defense?" His argument was that Logre's opinion came entirely from information provided by the defense, stating, "But who provided the information that shaped his conviction? Who gave him the necessary facts? The defense, and the defense alone, which told him only what it believed favored his client's case." Finally, Maître Moulier returned to the question of responsibility. He argued that the sisters had not lost their reason during the attack. The violence may have been extreme, but in his view, their actions afterward showed planning and awareness. He pointed to the fact that after the murders, they still understood their situation, deciding on a story to tell, and even took the time to secure the house by locking the door. While the fit of anger might have magnified their strength and fury, it did not cause them to lose their reason. They retained a perfect sense of time and of the state they were in. Once they had agreed on a means of defense, they had the presence of mind to go and bolt the front door. He argued that once the claim of madness failed, the sisters had adopted it as a strategy. He even suggested that Christine and Leah had coordinated their stories while in prison, despite being separated. Regarding the town hall incident, he argued that Christine's actions were not signs of delusion, but a deliberate attempt to gain financial independence from their mother. In the end, Maître Moulier gave the jury a clear message. "I am authorized to ask you, on behalf of all those civil parties, to show yourselves absolutely inexorable toward the Papin sisters. They deserve no pity, and since the hatred they harbored against their employers inspired, in the crimes they committed, acts of torture and cruelty found only among savage peoples, since they behaved like wild beasts, they must be treated as savages and wild beasts." At 7:25 p.m., the hearing was suspended for about 90 minutes. Because the court was not finished for the day, believe it or not. They just needed a dinner break. But by 9 p.m., everyone had returned to their seats in the courtroom. This was not unusual for a trial of this era. These proceedings could last late into the evening, especially in major criminal cases where the court wanted the jury to hear the entire case before deliberating. The goal was to finish the presentation of evidence and arguments while everything was still fresh in their minds. And now, at 9 p.m., it was time for the prosecution to speak. Representing society was Prosecutor Reger. Like Maître Moulier before him, Reger focused first on the brutality of the crime. He described a violent attack that began with Christine and then spiraled beyond control, before returning to the central question of the trial. Were these two women mentally ill, or were they responsible for what they had done? His answer was clear. Reger acknowledged that the crime appeared to have been committed by two psychologically disturbed women, but he relied completely on the conclusions of the three court-appointed psychiatrists. Those doctors, he reminded the jury, had personally examined the sisters and reached the same conclusion. And all three came to tell you, with their right hands raised in the gesture of taking an oath, in all good consciousness, these girls are not mad. They must answer for their actions. Like the civil party, Reger then attacked Dr. Logre's testimony. His criticism was not necessarily that Logre lacked expertise, it was that he had formed his opinion without ever examining Christine or Leah himself. Regier argued, he is the one who, in the Assize court, stands up before the official experts and tells them, "You three standing there are mistaken. You know nothing about this. I alone am right." Turning toward the defense, he continued, "My own experts, men of science every bit as accomplished as Dr. Logre, have seen the accused. They have studied them. They have delved into their very souls. Your witness, and I am certainly entitled to point out that he appears here at your expense, does not even know them. He has never laid eyes on them. To me, your witness seems to be performing the feat of solving a problem without knowing the data." Regier then returns to the central question. If Christine and Leah were not legally insane, how could they have committed a crime so horrific? His answer was that extreme violence does not always come from mental illness. The sisters, he argued, were not deranged. They suffer from no mental illness. They bear no burden of a tainted heredity. They are entirely normal intellectually, affectively, and emotionally. But normal people, he argued, could still commit terrible acts when overwhelmed by powerful emotions. There was, according to Regier, a difference between madness and rage. The crime was not the result of a medical condition. It was psychological. It was an eruption of anger and resentment, but the women remained responsible for their choices nonetheless. To illustrate his point, he used one of the most memorable comparisons of the trial. A rabid dog bites because disease has taken control of it. It attacks because it cannot help itself, driven by a pathological force. Such an animal cannot be considered responsible. But a vicious dog is different. A vicious dog can show affection. It can accept kindness, but if it feels provoked or mistreated, it may bite. According to Regier, the Papin sisters are not sick women. They are not rabid dogs. They are vicious dogs. For the prosecutor, Christine and Leah had not lost their reason. They had acted out of hatred, anger, and resentment, and therefore they had to answer for their actions. He argued the jury not only to convict, but to reject any possibility of mercy. "I tell you, there is no room here for pity. They showed no pity, none at all, for those two unfortunate women who wished them only well and asked for nothing more than to live." His final request was severe. The jury, he reminded them, were not there to forgive. They were there to apply the law. "You are here as ministers of the law. The law commands, and you must obey it. No pity for these monstrous gougers of eyes. I implore you to be pitiless, to be inexorable. I demand the maximum penalty. For this one, the penal colony. For that one, the scaffold." The final arguments belong to the defense attorneys. And the task before Christine's attorney, Maître Germain Brier, was enormous. By this point, public opinion had largely turned against Christine and Leah Papin. The brutality of the crime was difficult for anyone to move past. The defense was not asking the jury to deny what happened. They were asking them to see it differently. Maître Brier's argument was simple. You cannot treat sick people like criminals. Her challenge was to convince the jury that the sisters were not cruel women who had chosen evil, but two psychologically damaged women whose actions came from illness rather than ordinary human reasoning. After meeting with Christine and Leah herself, Brier explained that the sisters' answers had deeply affected her. She had questioned them about the motive for the crime and about what had happened that night. And their responses disturbed her, not because they seemed calculating, but because they seemed impossible to understand. There was no clear motive, no explanation that could truly account for what they had done. And what struck her most was that despite everything that had happened, the sisters still appeared to maintain the same respect for their victims that they had shown before the crime. She recalled, "Then an idea forced itself upon me irresistibly, and it has never left me. I was facing two wretched, deranged women." Briere then turned to Christine's life before the murders. She painted a portrait of a young woman shaped by abandonment, a difficult childhood, a harsh religious upbringing, and a deeply troubled relationship with her mother. But rather than focusing on the horror of the crime itself, she challenged the psychiatric evaluations that had declared the sisters responsible. She argued that important information had been overlooked. One example was the medical examiner's report. Briere questioned why the psychiatrist had not had access to the full details of their victims' injuries, the number and nature of the wounds specifically, which she believed would have provided important insight into Christine and Leah's mental state during the attack. She also criticized what she considered an incomplete investigation into the sisters' family history. The psychiatric report had found no significant family history of mental illness, but Breuer argued that the experts had not been given the full picture. She pointed to the father's alcoholism and alleged abuse toward the older sister, which I will interject here and remind you that although it could have been true, the only one accusing him of abusing Amelia was Clemence herself, and she had damn good motive to do so. But I digress. She also highlighted the mother's intense religious preoccupations in the letter, to which I think she means her obsession over whether her daughters will go into convent life or not. And of course, the additional family tragedies. She said that it was also revealed to us that a nephew of the accused woman mother had been institutionalized and that one of her brothers had hanged himself. There is no trace of this in the report. To Breuer, these details mattered because they could suggest a hereditary vulnerability to mental illness, an idea that carried significant weight in psychiatry at the time. Then she addressed one of the most controversial subjects of the trial, the psychiatric examination itself. In 1933, Breuer argued that the doctors had failed to investigate Christine and Leia's sexuality thoroughly enough. She questioned why the examinations had not included a physical examination of the sexual development and virginity, stating, "I am surprised that it did not focus on the genitals of the two accused women." She argued, and bear with me here because this is according to psychiatric thinking of the time, that a lack of sexual experience could be connected to certain mental disorders, stating, "There are certain psychoses that develop particularly in women who are still virgins or who do not lead a normal sexual life. Chastity can lead to disorders in women predisposed to mental illness." By modern standards, these beliefs are outdated and scientifically questionable. But in 1933, Breuer was using the psychiatric language available to her to argue that Christine and Leia's unusual emotional lives were evidence that something was psychologically wrong. She then returned to the turning point in the sisters' lives, their separation from their mother. Breuer argued that the emotional collapse that followed this conflict was a warning sign. The state preceded an event such as the crime of which the defendants are accused is of great significance. It can herald a crisis or mark a period of mental instability. She pointed again to the town hall incident, arguing that it gave the impression of women who were not thinking normally. She criticized the fact that the official report did not consider those behaviors significantly enough. She also challenged the amount of time the psychiatrist had spent examining the sisters. Doctors Baruch and Truel had spent only 2 hours with each woman. According to Breuer, that was nowhere near enough to reach a definitive conclusion. And I'm wondering now, since the report took several months, if this was like a few minutes of meeting the sisters here and there over time, and then taking their sweet time to write the report. I'm not really sure. But the attorney also pointed to Dr. Logre's opinion that a proper assessment would have required months of observation in a specialized psychiatric facility. The defense then focused on Christine's behavior after the murders. Breuer argued that her episodes in prison, Christine's that is, including hallucinations, fainting spells, seizures, foaming at the mouth, and hunger strikes, were not a behavior of a calculating criminal. They were evidence, she argued, of a disturbed mind. She cited testimony from fellow prisoners and prison staff. You can ask those who have tried near them. You can ask those who have lived near them for months. They will all tell you that they never showed any intention of defending themselves. They do not even realize the situation they are in. For Breuer, Christine's behavior proved that she was disconnected from reality. She then returned to one of the most disturbing details of the crime, the removal of the eyes and exposure of Genevieve Lancelin's body. Breuer argued that the experts had failed to ask Christine the right questions. She recalled asking Christine why she had undressed Mademoiselle Lancelin. It was a question the experts never put to her, and yet how significant it was. To Breuer, the act could suggest something far beyond ordinary violence. Did the fact that the trousers had been pulled down not, in effect, suggest an erotic act or an act of madness? She argued that this was another detail the psychiatrist had dismissed too quickly. And when asked why she had done it, Christine gave an answer that only deepened the mystery. She said she was searching for something she wanted to possess, something that would have made her stronger. She also claimed to remember a past life in which she had been her sister's husband and expressed a desire for a different body. To the defense, those statements were not evidence of guilt. They were evidence that Christine Papin was not thinking like a sane person. The entire defense rested on one idea. The crime was so extreme, so disconnected from the ordinary human motivation, that the only explanation was that the women who committed it were not ordinary criminals at all. She says, justice is not pitiless and brutal. It is not acts that it must judge, but human beings with all their frailties. And she goes on to suggest that the accused women must be rendered harmless by being treated as sick persons, and it is essential to take them to an asylum rather than to prison. In conclusion, Maître Breuer places the future of the Papin sisters in the hands of the jury. It seems to us that, at present, we do not see this matter clearly enough. The experts were unaware of certain facts, and significant events have occurred since their examination. We believe it would be desirable for a new psychiatric evaluation to be ordered. Following this new evaluation, which would provide us with full assurance, our consciences would allow us to reach a decision with the desired peace of mind. Today, the issue is not pity, but justice. You, gentlemen of the jury, are our ultimate hope, the ones to whom we turn to in desperation, imploring you to assist us in our search for truth. Oh, help us, gentlemen of the jury. Help us shed full light on this matter. This is all we ask of you. You cannot refuse us. The sole final argument belonged to Leia's defense attorney, Maître Pierre Chanton. Like Maître Breuer before him, Chanton challenged the conclusions of the psychiatric experts and requested another evaluation of the sisters' mental state. But while Breuer's defense had focused heavily on Christine's suffering, her childhood, and the emotional forces that may have shaped her behavior, Chanton approached it from a different angle. His argument was not simply that the sisters had suffered. It was that the court did not yet have enough information to determine their responsibility. The psychiatric evidence had become a battle of experts. As Chanton explained, facing one doctor, just one, is another doctor, a distinguished physician. One tells you, these women are not insane. The other says, be careful, there is more to it. To him, that disagreement alone created uncertainty. Reasonable doubt, you might say. This was not a question of choosing sides between two medical opinions. It was a question of whether the court could deliver a final judgment when respected experts disagreed about something as fundamental as the accused women's mental state. He argued, in any case, we are arguing a matter of principle. The consequences, he said, were too serious to rush. Whether the sisters were confined somewhere for treatment or faced punishment mattered less than making sure the court reached the correct conclusion. Even the possibility of execution, he argued, should not force the court into a decision without certainty, stating, "The guillotine? Such dramatic words. After all, women are not guillotined. What are we asking for? Not even extenuating circumstances." To be clear, the defense was not asking the jury simply to forgive Christine and Leia. They were asking the court to admit that there were unanswered questions. We cannot pass judgment because we lack sufficient information. After a further medical examination, our successors will be able to decide. The prosecution interjected by reminding the jurors of their duty. They were there to judge the accused based on the evidence already presented. Chanton, however, insisted that the judges and jurors were not bound to accept the existing conclusions without question. After all the arguments had been made, the floor was returned to the accused. Christine and Leia remained silent. So, presiding Judge Boucher declared the proceedings closed. He read aloud the questions from the indictment, asking the jury to decide whether the sisters were guilty of the crimes charged. By this point, it's 12:15 a.m. on September 30th, and all of this is not even over yet. After an entire day of testimony, psychiatric debate, and competing interpretations of the same evidence, the jurors retired to deliberate. But it doesn't take them long, as just 40 minutes later, at almost 1 a.m. in the morning, they have reached a verdict. So everyone settles back into the courtroom, and the foreman of the jury, named Louis Chaunot, says, with his hand over his heart, "On my honor and conscience, before God and before men, the declaration of the jury regarding the principal facts, along with their circumstances and mitigating circumstances, is as follows. 1. Is Christine Germaine Papin guilty of having, in Le Mans on February 2nd, 1933, intentionally caused the death death of Léonie Denise Marie Ringard, wife of Lancelin? Answer, yes, by a majority. Extenuating circumstances? Yes, by a majority, in favor of the accused Léa Isabelle Papin. 2. Is Christine Papin guilty of having, in Le Mans on February 2nd, 1933, intentionally caused the death of Geneviève Lancelin? Answer, yes, by a majority. Circumstances, did the murder specified above under number 2 precede, accompany, or follow the murder specified above number 1? Answer, yes, by a majority. 3. Is Léa Isabelle Papin guilty of having, in Le Mans on February 2nd, 1933, intentionally caused the death of Léonie Denise Marie Ringard, wife of Lancelin? Answer, yes, by a majority. The jury had reached its decision. Christine and Léa Papin were guilty. Now the court had to determine their punishment. The presiding judge read the article of law establishing the penalty for murder. Then came the sentence. Christine Papin was condemned to death, and Léa Papin was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and a 20-year ban from residing in Le Mans. The difference between the two sentences came down to the jury's recognition of mitigating circumstances for Léa. Although she was found guilty of the murders, the jury considered her role differently from Christine's. According to Christine's own statement to the investigating magistrate, Léa had entered the attack only after Christine had already done most of the damage. The two sisters stood together as the sentence and Article 12 of the Penal Code was read. Anyone sentenced to death shall be beheaded. When Christine heard those words, she collapsed to her knees. Her lawyer stepped forward and helped her back to her feet, and after that moment, there was no further visible display of emotion from either sister as the rest of the sentencing was read. The court then ordered the two women to pay legal costs of the trial jointly, and they were given 3 days to appeal the decision. Finally, the judge read the last ruling. The Papin sisters were ordered to pay 1 franc in damages to the civil party, the Lancelin family. And this was strictly symbolic, of course. It was certainly not meant to compensate the Lancelin family financially, but rather a legal acknowledgement of harm. And with that, at 1:15 a.m. on September 30th, the hearing was adjourned and the trial of Christine and Léa Papin had come to an end. After the verdict, Christine said, "Since they are going to cut off my head, they might as well do it right now." And she refused to eat or drink anything since. She is shackled and slumped against the wall by day and straitjacketed by night. Her mental health takes another nosedive, and there's a level of dissonance. She doesn't know why she's wearing a prison uniform, saying, "Why are they giving me all this? Why are they punishing me? I haven't done anything. Everyone mocks me and wishes me harm. Even my own sister doesn't love me anymore." But her lawyer is working on an appeal for a retrial, and she only has 3 days to do it and to get the sisters' signatures to submit it. And she does get Léa to submit it, and Christine says she will sign it, but inevitably she refuses, saying, "What's the point? I've said it all." However, given the nature of the heinous crime, Christine's case will also be reviewed. Maybe it's a matter of due process, I'm not actually really sure. But in any case, the appeals were denied anyway on November 29th. The defense had one more card to play though. For Christine, anyway. Léa would have to serve her sentence, but they could try one more thing for Christine. They could appeal for clemency, which basically means they could try to get the court to find some measure of mercy. That is, if they can get Christine to sign the appeal. Christine said that's out of the question, and her attorney presses back on this. "It's the only thing that can save you now. It's the only recourse." Christine says, "Let them do whatever they want with me." She had in Germaine Bruyère an attorney who simply would not give up, one who was prepared to argue for clemency herself if Christine refused to let her, because she genuinely did not believe that Christine was criminally responsible for what happened. And now, after the trial has ended, Bruyère is looking at her client, gaunt, hollowed out, with a vacant, unfocused stare, and refusing to let her wave away the one thing that might save her. You can argue diminished responsibility as a legal strategy. That's easily enough. What's harder to fake is this kind of urgency, the refusal to give up on a client who has, by this point, essentially given up on herself. And it worked. On January 22nd, 1934, the prosecutor received a decree from the President of the French Republic commuting Christine's death sentence to life imprisonment with hard labor. Christine was impassive, apparently, and it would only take 2 days after this for both she and Léa to be delivered to the penitentiary in Rennes to serve their hard labor sentences. So 2 things here. First, why did they commute Christine's death sentence, especially given that Christine didn't seem to care or fight it? Yes, Christine had been sentenced to death, but a death sentence did not automatically mean she would be executed. France had not abolished the death penalty for women, and a woman could still legally be sent to the guillotine. In fact, female executions would continue after Christine's case. But by the 1930s, there was already a growing hesitation around executing women. Part of that came from deeply rooted ideas about gender. Women were traditionally viewed as the weaker sex, more fragile and more influenced by others, and less naturally capable of extreme violence. Those beliefs were often based on outdated and paternalistic ideas, but they shaped how society viewed female criminals. A man convicted of murder could be seen as dangerous, who needs to be eliminated, and a woman convicted of murder often created a different reaction: shock and discomfort, and a desire to search for an explanation more thoroughly than a man's. People wanted to know what happened to make a woman commit such an act. Executing Christine would mean declaring with absolute certainty this woman was fully responsible, fully aware of her actions, and so dangerous that society itself needed to remove her. And that certainty was frightening, not only because of what Christine had done, but because of who she was. The Papin sisters were not strangers who had attacked from outside the home. They were domestic servants. They cooked the meals, they cleaned the rooms, and they cared for the children. They lived inside the homes of the families who employed them. They were present in the most private spaces of bourgeois life, often working while their employers slept. The crime forced an uncomfortable question into the minds of many families who relied on domestic workers every day. If someone like Christine Papin could commit an act of such extreme violence, what did that mean about the people living behind their own doors? The idea was deeply unsettling because it challenged a relationship built on trust, dependence, and familiarity. For a servant to commit such a crime was not only horrifying, it was destabilizing. It suggested that someone who appeared ordinary, someone who was welcomed into the home, could also carry hidden anger or violence. And that was a possibility many people were desperate not to confront. Because if Christine Papin was simply a dangerous, fully responsible woman, then the threat could not be explained away as madness or a unique tragedy. It meant someone like her could exist. And the second thing, what does being sentenced to hard labor even mean? Jean Valjean in Les Miserables comes to mind personally, but what actually was the reality of this sentence? The legal term was travaux forcés, and it was not simply a longer prison sentence or working inside a prison. I mean, kind of, but it was a punishment designed around both confinement and forced labor. For many convicted prisoners, this meant being sent to France's penal colonies, particularly in French Guiana or other overseas territories, where prisoners performed physically demanding work under extremely harsh conditions. The reality was brutal and is deserving of an episode on its own. The system was known for overcrowding, disease, poor conditions, and high mortality rates. Many prisoners did not survive their sentences, not necessarily because of the labor alone, but because of the environment in which they were forced to live. However, Leah Papin's sentence and Christine's clemency came with an important difference. They were women. And by the 1930s, women sentenced to travaux forcés were generally not sent to the same penal colonies as male convicts. Instead, female prisoners were typically held in a women's prison, where they performed forms of prison labor. Their days were structured around sewing, textile production, laundry repairs, and other forms of institutional labor. It was not a simple job meant to pass the time, but rather the labor was part of the sentence itself, a way for the state to impose discipline and extract work from those it had convicted. And for the 10 years that Leah was sentenced to hard labor in the Rennes Central Prison, and by all accounts, she carried out her work meticulously, almost like she was in her element and pulled it off beautifully. She didn't rebel and accepted her separation from her sister and imprisonment. Nevertheless, a dynamic of helping her sister persisted. On February 17, 1934, she wrote the prison warden a request, I have just received the sum of 185 francs today, and I would be very grateful if you would kindly place the sum of 120 francs into my sister's available savings. Meanwhile, Christine is incarcerated at the Rennes high security prison, and her condition is steadily worsening. She's completely withdrawn into silence, refuses to work, and there's difficulty eating normally, and has self-imposed isolation. On May 12, 1934, Dr. Parole, the physician at the Rennes Central Prison, sent an urgent request to the public prosecutor asking for Christine to undergo a psychiatric examination. Her mental state, he believed, required immediate attention. Christine was placed under observation, and Dr. Lamanche documented what he found. For several days, Christine remained in an observation cell. She lay in bed and had refused to get up for 48 hours. The doctor described her as showing signs of what they called a melancholic state. Her expression was anxious and depressed, her face was gaunt, and she appeared withdrawn from everyone around her. And from the beginning, she resisted contact. She refused to look at the doctors. She refused to answer questions. And when she finally spoke, it was only in a quiet voice and seemed to be with great difficulty. The few sentences they managed to draw from her were, "I don't deserve to live, thank you. I have to move, thank you. I'm good for nothing. I can't work. It's pointless to feed me." Christine's condition became even more concerning when she was brought face to face with Leah again. Because if you'll recall, it helped Christine to see Leah before the trial. But now when Leah appeared before her, Christine showed almost no recognition. She looked at her sister and said, "It's not her, it's someone else. She's very nice, but she's not my sister. If she were my sister, I wouldn't be in this state." She stared at Leah a long time before repeating, "It's not Leah." Christine believed that her sister had changed, saying that Leah has lowered herself and gone back to her former master. And when Leah left, Christine watched without any visible emotion. The doctors also recorded her refusal to participate in even basic examinations. She refused to show her tongue and refused to drink milk despite repeated attempts. But the most serious concern was her refusal to eat. Since arriving at Rennes Central Prison, Christine had become increasingly withdrawn. She participated in no activities, spent long periods lost in thought, and often refused to answer questions. For several weeks, she remained completely silent. The only words she regularly repeated were, "Thank you." She refused all food. At first, prison officials attempted to maintain her nutrition through nutrient enemas. And when she rejected those, doctors began giving her subcutaneous saline injections to keep her alive. Her sleep was irregular. Her health was deteriorating. She had lost a significant amount of weight and her heart rate was elevated. Dr. Lamanche concluded, "Since her arrival in Rennes, Christine Papin has presented as a melancholic patient harboring feelings of unworthiness, feelings that are doubtless justified, yet accompanied by reactions that endanger her life, a systematic refusal of all food persisting for several weeks." He noted that her condition was worsening rather than improving, and after months of observation, the doctors concluded that Christine was unable to adapt to ordinary prison life. Other medical reports reached the same conclusion, describing a state of severe melancholia, crying, silence, and a desire to allow herself to die. So the question was no longer whether Christine could simply serve her sentence behind prison walls, but whether a prison was even capable of caring for someone in this condition. After reviewing Dr. Lamanche's report, the prefect of Ille-et-Vilaine decided that Christine needed to be transferred to a psychiatric facility. She could not remain in the penitentiary that did not have the resources to treat her condition, which doctors of the era described using terms such as self-punishing melancholia or schizophrenia. On May 25, 1934, Christine Papin was admitted to Saint-Méen Asylum in Rennes under the care of Dr. Pierre Guillet, chief physician of the women's unit. And Saint-Méen was not a new institution, by the way. The facility had existed for centuries, originally founded in 1627 as a refugee for pilgrims visiting the shrine. It was not until 1724 that the first mentally ill patients were admitted. And over time, it became part of France's developing psychiatric system. The Monvier Law of June 30th, 1838, which organized psychiatric care throughout France, transformed the way asylums were managed and allowed these institutions to move beyond purely religious administration toward a more medical approach. And by the time Christine arrived in 1934, psychiatry was beginning to change. The 1930s were a period where new biological approaches to mental illness were emerging, along with early forms of occupational and social rehabilitation. But many of the treatments were associated with modern psychiatric care simply did not exist yet. Psychoanalysis would not become part of the institution's approach until 1950, and effective medications for psychotic illnesses would not arrive until later. Christine Papin arrived too early to benefit from these developments. In other words, she was admitted during a period when doctors had far fewer tools available to understand or treat severe mental illness. Her care was largely focused on observation, management of symptoms, and maintaining her physical condition, not the therapies or medications that would become available in later decades. So her doctor would see Christine every day and treat her for 3 years. In addition to all the same symptoms and behaviors we've already seen, he said she was showing signs of schizophrenic progression. He also confirmed that she had not received any visitors. Her mother, Clemency, did write a letter dated August 7th, 1934, which said, "Dear Sir, I am writing to ask if you could please give me an update on the health of my daughter, Christine Papin, and whether the doctor sees any improvement in her condition. Unfortunately, she did not receive timely treatment. I am counting on you, doctor, if possible. You understand my ordeal. And if she speaks of me, her mother, sir, consider just how sorely tired I am." And regardless, I think, of where you stand on what Christine deserved at this point, this moment is difficult to read for me. Clemency writes that her daughter did not receive timely treatment, and that statement is difficult for me to sit with because the question that naturally follows for me is, how did the person who knew her best, her own mother, not recognize that suffering before it reached this point? And where was that concern before Christine reached the breaking point? Then, at the end of the letter, the focus shifts back to Clemency herself. It's not surprising. She asks the doctor to consider how deeply she has suffered, and that is what makes this letter so complicated. It does not show a mother who feels nothing. She's asking about her daughter's condition, and she wants the information. But it also reflects the pattern we have seen throughout this entire story. Even in moments centered around her daughter's pain, Clemency's own suffering remains at the forefront. And there's something deeply painful about parents who become so consumed by their own perspective and their own pain and their own feelings, or even their own needs, that they fail to see the suffering of their own children when that suffering is connected, at least in part, to the environment they themselves created. I still don't know exactly how I feel about the crime itself in the sense, Christine, what she did was horrific, but I can't separate that and ignore the sadness and the sense of loss I feel when looking at what these two sisters endured before that night. Because before they were defendants, they were two daughters who spent years struggling. And the person who should have seen that suffering the most was the person who seems to have seen it the least. From the moment Christine arrived at the asylum, she seemed determined to let herself die. The woman who had been sentenced to death, but ultimately spared the guillotine, appeared to impose a different kind of sentence upon herself. She stopped eating and withdrew from the world, and she slowly allowed her body to deteriorate. By the end of her life, Christine had become profoundly emaciated. At the time, psychiatrists described this state as cachexia of insanity, a term used to describe the extreme physical deterioration that could occur in patients suffering from severe mental illness and prolonged refusal of food. And on the evening of Tuesday, May 8th, 1937, her decline finally ended. Christine Papin died at the asylum at 32 years old. The cause of death was noted as a pulmonary or bone condition resulting from malnutrition. Whatever you think of Leah Papin, this had to be another devastating loss. For better or worse, they had survived almost everything together. And now that connection was gone and she was forced to build a life entirely on her own. But we saw Leah adapt to prison life. The conditions were harsh and the institution's rules were severe, but records from this period described a woman who was considered calm, cooperative, and capable of work. After serving about 5 years of her sentence, Leah became eligible to request parole. In France, conditional release had been introduced by the law of August 14th, 1885. It was designed to reward prisoners who demonstrated good behavior during their incarceration by allowing them to be released before the official end of their sentence. But it was not a right. It was a privilege granted at the discretion of authorities. If the person committed another offense during the remaining period of their sentence, they could be returned to prison. On January 28, 1938, Leah applied for parole. The report sent by the prefect to the public prosecutor in Le Mans painted a positive picture of her life in prison. Leah was described as being in good health and capable of working. She was assigned to the workshop producing waterproof garments, where she was considered a highly skilled worker. Her temperament was described as gentle, her behavior was considered exemplary, and officials noted that her moral character gave no cause for concern. The report also revealed that Leah had resumed contact with her mother. The two corresponded regularly and affectionately, and Clémence had promised that if Leah were released, she would provide her with both employment and housing. The prison warden supported Leah's request for parole. And while Leah waited to learn her fate, the reality of prison life continued. A letter dated February 27, 1938, reveals that although she had adapted to incarceration, the physical demands were taking a toll. Dear Sir, I'm writing to request a transfer out of workshop 2, as I find it very exhausting to be on my feet all day, and the smell of benzene bothers me greatly. Since I still have 5 years of service remaining, I would like to spend that time in a seated position. Please accept, sir, the expression of my deep respect. But despite the favorable reports, the public prosecutor rejected Leah's application for parole. After serving about 9 years and 5 months, she was released from prison in February 1943 at the age of 31. It is likely that her mother was waiting for her, as Clémence had previously promised to provide her with work and housing after her release. The two would have had to leave Le Mans behind, though, because Leah's sentence included a 20-year ban on residing in the city. Her next destination was likely Nantes, where Clémence was living at the time. And then Leah Papin disappears from the historical record. Or at least she almost did. Over the decades that followed, a few possible traces of her emerged, but none could be fully confirmed. In the 1960s, 2 people came forward claiming to have encountered the mysterious former maid of the Lancelin household. But the details surrounding these meetings remain unclear. Both individuals reportedly promised to protect Leah's anonymity, and that promise only deepened the mystery. We know that in 1957, Leah was the person who reported her mother's death. So at the time, she was living with Clémence in Nantes and working as a seamstress from her home. Some accounts suggested that she may have lived as a chambermaid under the name Marie, but no legal documents have confirmed this. In fact, when her mother died, Leah was still signing her name as Papin. Of Clémence's immediate family, only Amélie remained, the older Papin sister who had become a nun with the Sisters of the Good Shepherd. Amelia died at the polyclinic on December 27, 1986, at the age of 84. Leah's wider family also gradually disappeared from the record. Earlier in this series, I had mentioned that I wondered whether Gustave Papin, the father, may have died during the war simply because there appeared to be no trace of him afterwards. But as I was digging deeper, I found and translated a chapter from a later work that clarified what had happened. Gustave did survive the war and was, in fact, still alive when Leah was released from prison in 1943. After divorcing Clémence, he had remarried on October 7, 1922, and had another son from that marriage. But he did die on February 18, 1950. And then there's the question, when did Leah Papin die? And the answer is we still do not know. Over the years, there have been several alleged sightings. They are impossible to verify, as I said. There are also later claims that Leah appeared in a 2000 documentary by a respected French documentarian Claude Ventura. According to those accounts, the woman filmed was believed by some to be Leah Papin, and if true, it would mean she lived into her 90s. We have spent a significant time here at L'Histoire trying to access this documentary and verify this footage. And there are screenshots of the film, but so far I have not been able to obtain a copy. I have included the IMDb page in the description, and if anyone has access to this film or knows where it can be viewed, I would genuinely love to hear from you. While Leah's fate faded into uncertainty, the house where the tragedy unfolded remained. Renee Lancelin continued living in the home on Rue Bruyere for roughly another 20 years after the murders. Unable to sell the property immediately, he remained there and remarkably continued living with another housekeeper. Eventually, the house changed ownership several times over the years, leaving behind the memory of what had happened there decades earlier. Like so many places connected to tragedy, the house continued to exist long after the people whose lives were changed inside it were gone. Renee's financial allegations that had once attracted attention literally days before the murders were largely overshadowed by the Papin case itself, and the historical record offers little clarity about how those matters were ultimately resolved. After nearly a century of speculation, the final chapter of Leah Papin's life remains unwritten. No death date appears in the margins of her birth certificate or her official records of dossier. No document has ever definitively closed the story of Leah Papin. And perhaps, in a strange way, that uncertainty is fitting. Because this is a story that refuses to give us the answers we demand. We want closure. We want a final piece of evidence that allows us to say, now I understand. But the Papin case has never been that simple. It is a story filled with contradictions, of violence and vulnerability and responsibility and suffering and cruelty and tragedy. And perhaps that is why, nearly a century later, we are still searching for answers that may never come. There is an enormous amount that has been written about the Papin sisters. Over the decades, respected historians, psychiatrists, writers, and researchers have offered their own interpretations of what had happened. They have examined the crime through the lens of psychology, class, trauma, gender, and society. And every one of those perspectives offers something worth considering. Some are fascinating, some are thought-provoking, and some I personally find difficult to accept. But after spending so much time with this case, I found myself returning to one thing: the story itself. Because sometimes when a case becomes famous enough, the people at the center of it can disappear beneath all the theories built around them. Christine and Leah became symbols. They became arguments, and they became examples used to explain everything from class oppression to mental illness. But before they were any of those things, they were two sisters. Two women whose lives were shaped by their childhood, their family, their circumstances, and the people around them. Two women who made a choice that resulted in unimaginable violence, and two women whose lives were also marked by years of isolation, hardship, and suffering before that moment. The truth is, there is no single explanation that can neatly tie this story together. No theory that can erase what happened to those two victims or fully explain how two people arrived at such a horrific act. And maybe that is why this case has endured for nearly a century, because it forces us to sit with something uncomfortable. That human beings are rarely just one thing. A person can do something horrifying and still have a history that is tragic. A person can be responsible for their actions and still have suffered. A person can be a victim of circumstances and still cause unimaginable harm. The tragedy of the Papin sisters is not that we do not have enough theories. It is that even with all the testimony and records and analyses and all these decades of searching for answers, we are still left with two human beings we can never fully understand. And perhaps that is the closest thing to closure this story allows us. À la prochaine. See you next time.